I'm not wild about a lot of government action in the marketplace. I'm not against regulation per se. It's just that having gotten my educational background, I have a PhD in public policy. I'm quite aware of things like concepts like regulatory capture and how a lot of these agencies that are supposed to regulate economic activity for the public good, for the common good, instead they do it for the advantage of many of the richest, biggest, most powerful companies out there. And as such, I'm not that big a fan of regulations as a consequence. Again, I'm not against them. Clearly, I would not want to buy meat from the grocery store if the economy was completely unregulated. I just am generally suspicious of government action. But once in a while, you get one of these stories that shows that sometimes government regulation actually works, assuming the courts let certain things happen. And so we have the story out of the European Union, France specifically. That is a good sign of hope for those of us who don't want to have, meat, or not meat, but fake things marketed to us as meat, because there's a very real movement going on right now among the plant-based zealots to make their fake meats look as real meat, as close to real meat as they possibly can, including steaks. I mean, I've done videos on these before showing how they make synthetic steaks, and they try to make them look as real as possible, and then they want to sell them in the meat department, usually under a branded name that is sometimes not that clear on what it is you're eating. And most people don't really read the labels and packaging. You would think that labeling a product as meat would be limited to things made from meat, even if they're processed a little bit or a lot. I mean, here in my mind, these things should be limited to things like bacon you buy at the store, deli meat, Carnivore Crisps on the cleaner end of things. Those sorts of things should be the only thing you can label as a meat. But of course, we live in a world where you can label Impossible Burgers as meat, which is just nuts. So this story here is actually a sign of potentially good government action, although this doesn't go far enough for my taste. But if government is going to take the action, they should take action. That's been always my thing on this. So for this story today, we go to Reuters, which is about as mainstream a news outlet as you're going to find. Get this headline: France makes fresh bid to ban meat names for plant-based food. That should be common sense. You shouldn't be able to advertise something that it isn't. In America, at least, we have these false advertising laws, but of course they don't cover this stuff either because of legal loopholes and regulatory loopholes put in to advantage certain companies and disadvantage others. That's actually where a lot of regulation comes from. They're proposed by the companies that stand them to gain the most advantage in the marketplace at the expense of their competitors. That's usually how it works, and it's really annoying, and I wish there was a way we could do something about it, but until we find ourselves in a place where businesses aren't necessarily treated as people themselves, as an entity, we might not ever be able to deal with it. But this, at least for the Europeans, is a good step forward. But as you'll see here, it doesn't go far enough. That having been said, I'd love to see this here in America. So from the article, quote, France unveiled on Monday revised proposals banning the use of meat names like steak and spare ribs for plant-based food made in the country, as it seeks to avoid misleading claims of some meat alternatives. The first country in the European Union to attempt to impose such a restriction, France had already tried to pass a measure in June last year, but it was suspended by the country's highest administrative court a month later, which argued that it was too vague and the timing too short. The global plant-based protein market has seen a sharp rise in recent years, mainly driven by increasing demand for environment-friendly and healthy food. The industry often references to meat products, fueling anger among livestock farmers and meat processors in France, the EU's biggest agricultural producer. The new draft decree, which only applies to products made and sold in France, bans a list of 21 meat names to describe protein-based products, including steak, escalope, spare ribs, ham, or butcher. However, over 120 meat-associated names, such as cooked ham, poultry, sausage, or bacon, will still be authorized, providing that the products do not exceed a certain amount of plant proteins, with percentages ranging between 0.5% and 6%. This new draft decree reflects our desire to put an end to misleading claims by using names relating to meat products for foodstuffs that do not contain them, French Agricultural Minister Marc Fesneau said in a statement. End quote. It's a good start. They're going to run into a major problem in the EU. You'll notice the caveat. There was a caveat in that article. And that caveat is it only applies to products made in France. See, in the European Union, they have essentially the free movement of goods and services, as well as the free movement of labor and other things. And that's because of the EU is slowly moving itself towards becoming sort of a United States of Europe. This has been a long goal of many people there, regardless of what the people on the ground may think of that, because it's not as popular among the normal Europeans as it is among the politicians. Go figure. But the EU as a body, the actual European Commission and the other governing bodies, they're the ones who control the interstate commerce, we'll say. Commerce between France and Belgium and Germany and the rest. And so France can't actually ban these products, these foreign products. They'd like to, I'm sure, but they can't. And a lot of products sold anywhere in the EU comes from other European Union member states. It's as simple as that. So there are some limitations to this. But the French are pretty nationalistic people, all things considered, and I would strongly suspect that they tend to buy more French-made goods than anything else. That's, if you know anything about the French attitude about these things, they have regulations on what you can call champagne, for example, because champagne is a specific reference to a specific adult beverage from a specific part of France. And so they have regulations on how certain things can be in their country. And more power to them on that, as far as I'm concerned. You're likely to see that the French people are not going to be so open to buying the foreign products, probably the foreign meats, the fake meats and things. But then again, you never know, because France also has a higher level of plant-based people than in other places. France, Germany, and England have all been like at the forefront of a lot of the fast food companies, for example, test marketing their plant alternatives there. And strangely, they've been more successful there than in the United States, where I expected in the US, at least in some parts of the country, Americans to be more open to it than other places. But I was wrong on that. Maybe they didn't test them in the right marketplaces in America. I don't know. But in general, this is, to me, a good thing. You have to limit what it is that can be labeled as ground meat. You have to, because a plant slop that it looks like vaguely like ground beef, bleeds like ground beef, and is supposed to taste like ground beef, but never, ever does, shouldn't be labeled meat. Come up with some other name for it, but it's not meat. Meat comes from an animal. That's where it comes from. And they get away with this because we have used as common parlance, common everyday language, to describe things like the meat of a banana or the meat of an apple or some other, use of that word, the flesh of fruit. We've done that for a long time, and that's how they get away with this in some places. And it's nice to see the French stepping forward and saying, no, not in our country, not in our marketplace, not with things made here. Now, the easiest workaround, of course, for those companies in France is to simply open a factory up in Berlin. That's the easiest thing for them to do. Or maybe to some of the Mediterranean members of the European Union, where the economy is not as strong and where the cost of doing work will be not as high. So imagine them opening these factories in Greece and Spain and some of these other not as economically strong countries in the European Union, and then they can just easily import them to France and get away with this. But again, I'm pretty cynical. But in general, I take this to be a good thing, that the French have stepped forward and said, you're not going to label your fake meat as steak and, other things, while still recognizing that the ultra-processed meats they can still do that to a degree with ultra-processed meats, but even then, you can't call a, fake bacon unless it doesn't contain unless it contains a real amount of meat protein in it too. So that's good news. I'm curious what you thought of this story, though. Would you like to see this kind of regulation here in the United States of America or in Canada or wherever you're watching it? Let me know in the comments, and hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. I'm Anthony Stine, the Practical Carnivore. Thanks for tuning in.